I'm John Hilbolt, and as Director of Lectures and Seminars for the Heritage Foundation, it is my privilege to welcome you to our special celebration for the life and legacy of M. Stanton Evans, or as we all knew him, a dear friend who brought enlightenment and joy to our lives. Hosting our program today is Becky Norton Dunlop, Heritage's Vice President for External Relations. I have known her since the days when CPAC was first gathering at the Hyatt Regency, just on the other side of Capitol Hill, or as Stan often reminded us, and we saw in the clip today, in those days when we were all only part of the half-vast right-wing conspiracy. Mrs. Dunlop is a member of the American Conservative Union Board of Directors, and she is also a former ACU political director. Please join in welcoming her. Becky?
Thank you so much, John. Let me add my words of welcome to each of you who are here today and those of you who will be watching this video. We've already had requests from people who would like to see this in the future. We're delighted that you came to join us today to pay tribute to a remarkable man who was a founding leader of our conservative movement. I'm delighted to welcome you today on behalf of the Heritage Foundation, and our president, Jim DeMint, who's sitting right over here, is going to have to slip out, but wanted to be down here, he said, to see the famous people who came to pay tribute to Stan. So thank you, Jim, for coming. We are also particularly pleased to welcome a number of members of Stan's family, and I'd like to ask you to stand if you would and let us just thank you for coming here today. We'll also be hearing from one of those members of the family a little bit later. Each of the speakers that we have on the program today enjoyed a special relationship with Stan. And I mention that because we've given them all about 3 minutes. They're not going to be able to touch on all their great memories with Stan, but I want you to know that each of them was invited because they have a special and personal relationship with him. My own relationship with Stan started when I was very young and joined the staff of the American Conservative Union. I tell interns today that I began my career as a gopher, one who goes for this and goes for that. And it was a pleasure to go for Stan Evans, who had lots of friends not only around Capitol Hill and town, but in the movement. And it was working with him and for him that I was able to meet so many of the great leaders of the movement and be inspired to spend my life really working for our liberties. In the tribute that I wrote for the Washington Times, I noted Stan's appearance at CPAC 2014 and how he recounted at that performance that he had some of the history of ACU and the role that he particularly and personally played and ACU played in the political life of our nation. One special note that he made reference to in that appearance was the independent campaign that ACU ran on behalf of Ronald Reagan in conjunction with the Senator Helms operation in North Carolina, which brought victory in 1976, the first victory that Reagan had in the primaries, and allowed him to continue the campaign right up to the convention and laid the groundwork, if you will, through all of the efforts of ACU for a success in 1980. And of course, he also played a particular role in the lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court, Buckley versus Vallejo, which was just an important battle for freedom, individual freedom. I urge you to go and watch that YouTube video. It was one of Stan's final personal appearances where you can actually experience not only his recounting of history, but the humor that just kept us all in stitches even that evening. He was a great leader and a great boss, and it was my pleasure to have the honor to begin my career with him. Now, we know this morning that some of you are going to be limited in your time with us. We want to thank you for being here. We know that some of you will have to get up and leave. We just ask you to try and do so without disrupting others in the audience. We've got a wonderful group of people who are going to speak today. And we're going to begin with some words from Ed Fulner. Ed had to leave for Europe, but he cut a video. So we're going to start with a video we'll ask you to watch, and then I'll come up and introduce the speakers to follow. Thank you very much, and enjoy the video.
For 60 years, our good friend Stan Evans has been the glue that has held the conservative movement together. Stan understood from his earliest days as the youngest editor of a major metropolitan newspaper in the United States, right up through his training of so many hundreds of great young journalists, that the conservative movement is fundamentally built on a series of ideas and a series of commitments. And those commitments are to a free and ordered society, to a free economy, to traditional values, and to a strong national defense. Through his era of creating the Sharon Statement that brought us all together, down through his decades of service here in Washington to so many organizations, to our own beloved Philadelphia Society, and to, of course, his National Journalism Center. Stan has been center and forward, really, for what we as conservatives truly believe in. He really has been that glue that held us all together. Stan, we'll really miss you.
Coming to the podium now is Lou Euler. He's the founder and president of the National Tax Limitation Committee and a leader in the national movement for a tax limitation balanced budget in the United States Constitution. Like Stan, Lou was a member of the class of 1955 at Yale University. Lou?
Thanks so much. You can't do anything about Stan in 3 minutes, but we'll give it a try. I first met him when we were freshmen at Yale in the fall of 1951, and Buckley had left in 50, so there was a task ahead of us. And of course, Stan, always the movement organizer, decided that we had to build a conservative infrastructure at a very liberal Yale. So we began with the independent library. We started with the Party of the Right in the political union. We created Comment magazine, and I brought along an article that I found in the November '53 edition that Stan wrote. And anybody who'd like to have a copy, why, I've got that available. And so we began to work together at that time and for the rest of our time together at Yale. And a couple of little vignettes in the summer of 1954, while he got in his car and drove out to Southern California to join us for a couple of weeks. And you'll see some pictures here that I found of Stan on the beach. We taught him to body surf there, and he had great fun. And then we drove back, and his father had just taken a position teaching in Abilene, Texas. So we drove, stayed overnight there, and took out the next morning. And about an hour out of Abilene, the engine blew. I mean, a rod blew. It was done. So we had packed the car badly, and we had to thumb our way into Fort Worth to a pawn shop and get some cardboard suitcases, which we then filled and got on a trailway and went from Fort Worth to New Haven on the trailway, sitting in the back of the bus. And that's when I discovered that Stan played a mean ukulele. And we entertained the entire crowd all the way to New Haven. And we had enough fun, and the thing about Stan, he could be a tough adversary, but he was always a very friendly, outgoing guy, as you all know. And so even though we were a modest crowd at Yale, the conservatives at the time, nevertheless, in Berkeley College, one of the residential colleges where we shared a room, why they recognized us by calling the senior ball the reactionary ball. And so we had great fun together as we did that. Then post Yale, of course, we've worked together continuously. He was a founding member of our National Tax Limitation Committee, along with Milton Friedman and others with whom we worked. And so it's been a lifelong friendship and relationship as we've tried to work together to help all of you build the conservative movement to what it is. Remember, when we started, there was no Heritage, there was no Cato, there were no SPNs, there was nothing. When I worked for Ronald Reagan as governor and toured the country to try and recruit the best free market minds I could find, it was one by one by one by one, but it is the movement that Stan helped to create that has now created the kind of sinew that we have, and we're ready to turn this country around in this next election. Many thanks.
Thank you, Lou. Many of you know that Stan taught at Troy State University in Alabama for more than 30 years. Our next speaker, Tom Davis, was a member of Stan's first class at Troy, and later worked for him at the National Journalism Center. Following a newspaper career in Alabama and Georgia, Tom returned to Troy in 1998. He also serves as a speechwriter and executive assistant to the chancellor. Tom Davis.
Good morning, fellow students of M. Stanton Evans. And I call you fellow students because if you knew him, you learned from him, and if you didn't know him, you wouldn't be here. It's a very special moment for me to talk about a wonderful man. I bring greetings on behalf of our chancellor at Troy, our board of trustees, the entire Troy University family. As Becky said, I was in Stan's first class in 1980, wonderful teacher. But to sum up Stan and Troy, I have to relay a little bit of a conversation I had. A friend of mine called the other day from Eufaula, Alabama, about 60 miles east of Troy. And Stan used to go over there, and we used to listen to friends of ours who had formed a rock and roll band in midlife. And we would go over there to their little gigs and all that, and Stan loved it, and he knew them all. And one of the guys called me and said, I never realized that our Stan was M. Stanton Evans. And he would have been pleased to hear that because he didn't seek the limelight. Everybody in Troy knew that Stan was a really big deal. But sometimes they didn't know all the depth and breadth of it. They knew he was a writer and a columnist and an author, but he often said one of the best things about coming to Troy for 30 years is I just don't get trapped by somebody frantic over the outcome of a special election in Iowa. I get to break away from that a little bit. I get an escape from that, and he would talk about all sorts of important things, sports and music and many, many things that I'm not going to start down that road because my 3 minutes is going to be obliterated anyway. But he achieved a great brand of fame of his own at Troy. He taught us to think like reporters when you wrote editorials. He taught us to dig. He taught us the importance of bringing yourself to the story. And a lot of people took that to heart. And it was wonderful. He was such a great teacher. When I was in his first class, a lot of us first-generation college students at a small school like Troy, then some 3,500 students on that campus, he wanted to encourage us that we could do things beyond what our imagination ever dreamed. And he would say, if you apply yourself, you can get as good an education at Troy as you can get in the Ivy League. Now, several years later, I realized that coming from Stan, that wasn't quite the compliment I thought it was at the time. Stan also told us, and this will sound familiar to National Journalism Center alumni, Mr. Fund and others I see, that, and I worked for Stan for the NJC for 3 years, so I heard it in stereo. I heard it at Troy and I heard it at the NJC. Get that practical experience. He was a bug for that practical experience. And he supported that ethos at Troy across deans. Deans would change, faculty would come and go, but he would say, work on the campus newspaper, work in the campus TV station, get that experience. He preached that to student after student after student. And the last conversation I had with him, I told him that the Troy University's Hall School of Journalism and Communication was just ranked 6th in a national survey of practicing journalists based in large part on our emphasis on practical training. And I told him, I said, your influence had a lot to do with that, and that pleased him. He loved his students. They loved him back. Facebook, Twitter had words from former Troy students. He made me better. He cared about me. I learned more from him than any other teacher, and I could say that as well. He also works with Stan's influence transcended journalism. He works with our economist in the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. He calls them his political ninjas. He teaches them how to write columns. And finally, his wit was always on display. During one local interview, he gets interviewed a lot when he comes to Troy. I mean, he's a genuine celebrity, and he was asked to cite an example of how journalism education changed over the years, and he said the biggest mistake was you shouldn't have gotten rid of the desk with the built-in ashtrays. But I will say, Stan, in closing, I will say that Stan immersed himself in the finer things of college life, a lot of baseball, basketball games, holding forth at the such elegant night spots as the Double Branch Saloon. Sidelines Sports Bar in the Troy Holiday Inn was a favorite. And during the earlier years at Troy, I was fortunate he would rent out a local club for end of the semester dance parties. So he was quite a popular professor, as you might can imagine. As a son of the South, he was comfortable in Troy, Alabama, and he made friends from all walks of life. And a lot of people knew that I knew him. And so every year, as the new year would start, I would be asked by people as diverse as the chancellor of the university and the owner of the local pizza place, the public address announcer at our baseball games. They would say, when is Stan coming back? I just can't wait to see him. People from all walks of life. Stan won't be coming back, but his legacy at Troy will live on to the thousands of students he taught and inspired. We loved him at Troy as you loved him here. And he was my friend, and I'm glad to honor him. To quote Stan, my time is up. I thank you for yours.
Whitney Ball is president and CEO of Donors Trust, a donor-advised fund serving the Liberty Movement. She also served as director of finance for Stan Evans Education and Research Institute. Whitney Ball.
Stan Evans made an indelible imprint on my life. And as Becky just mentioned, and many of you know, I was never an NJC intern, but Stan was my first boss out of college. I was hired to be an assistant in the development department in the National Journalism Center, a job I found through the Heritage Job Bank. And I came to NJC as a Republican. Kind of, sort of conservative, but not really, and certainly not a thoughtful conservative. All that changed thanks to Stan's mentoring. Even though I didn't participate in the intern program, just being around him and working with him was enough to absorb the true foundational principles of liberty, the evils of government run amok, the awesome power of the free market, and just the ability to hone the habit of critical thinking and consistent thinking. And all of this, of course, with a huge amount of great wit and humor. Stan was just fun to be around. And little did I know at the time that I would have Stan to thank for setting me on a course for a really meaningful career in the liberty movement, a career that I love and am really blessed to have. I meet a lot of conservatives and libertarians around the country and outside of Washington, and many of them don't know Stan. They've never heard of him. But know him or not, they are most certainly influenced by him through the countless journalists and commentators that they're exposed to on a daily basis. And these are the people who've sat at Stan's feet, many of them. Stan was so generous with his time with young people, teaching them and speaking to them. For a man who eschewed fame the way he did, and so uncharacteristic of a Washington insider, Stan's reach and influence are outsized, unquestionably nationwide and enduring. I only spoke to Stan a few times during his illness, but even when things were getting difficult, his generosity and sense of humor were ever present. He never failed to ask how I was doing. He never failed to crack a joke or two. And for those of you who are praying for him, he truly appreciated it. He believed in the power of prayer, and he always let me know he was praying for me too. This past week of reading memorials and reminiscing about Stan with friends has been bittersweet. It's been full of tears and laughter. But, I know Stan would be pleased. What more could any of us hope for? He left a legacy of liberty and laughter. He was a wonderful man, a true hero of the revolution, and one of the funniest people I have ever known. And I will truly miss him. Thank you.
Jim Roberts. Jim is president of Radio America and the American Veterans Center. He served as political director and then executive director at ACU for 3 years while Stan was chairman, and I was privileged to be his colleague there. Jim Roberts.
Thank you very much, Becky. As she mentioned, a colleague of mine at ACU when Stan was chairman. It's great to be here. I worked for Jack Kemp for 2 years, and 3 minutes had a very elastic definition that said, I'm going to try. I got a lot packed in here, and I first met Stan Evans in the fall of 1967 when I was a college student at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and Stan was editor of the Indianapolis News. The Conservative Club, of which I was a leader, had been asked by the Student Senate to recommend a conservative to debate Robert Theobald, a leftist economist, on some issue or other, and we chose Stan. So Stan and his wife, his then wife, Sue Ellen, who was very elegantly dressed, including a fur stole, made the 2-hour drive over from Indianapolis. And as Stan told me later, the moderator began his introduction. Stan opened his briefcase, and his prepared remarks were not there. So he had to wing the whole thing. Nobody, I'm sure in the audience, even knew that. He was so good, so brilliant. He pulled it off without a flaw. After the debate, I took Stan and Mrs. Evans over to the Sigma Nu house for a Q&A with the brothers. We had a mascot, a huge St. Bernard dog named Floyd, who was, despite the name, a female, and also crazy, as you can imagine from living in a house with 80 guys. Well, Floyd spied Sue Ellen and her fur stole, bounded through the room, leaped into the air, and landed on her lap, where he proceeded to gnaw on the stole and with heavy growling. So we got the dog off, things calmed down, the Evanses prepared to leave, And as a parting shot, I had the chutzpah to ask Stan, would you mind donating your honorarium to the Conservative Club? Which he did. That's Stan for you. In December of 1973, I was hired at the American Conservative Union, and I reported there at the beginning of the next year, the January of '74. Becky was already there just out of college as a state affiliate director. And our staff was engulfed in preparation along with YAF for the first CPAC conference, and which was scheduled only a little more than a month away. The hotel was booked, and then Governor Ronald Reagan had agreed to be the speaker. The only problem was nobody else was attending. ACU had never done anything like this. There were no lists to draw on. And so we were in crisis mode. Out in Indianapolis, Stan spent his time on the phone cutting deals with Phyllis Schlafly and Reed Irvine and every other conservative leader that he could think of. And in his daily calls with Executive Director Ron Deere, inspiring us with such words as, "Bring in the winos." First CPAC turned out to be a success, of course. About 400 attended, with 1,000 or so at the Reagan dinner, and now has gone on to be this tremendous success we see today. For the first 4 nights at CPAC, Stan could be found every night in the hospitality suite, engaged in SD, serious drinking, as he put it, literally dancing the night away, doing the jitterbug, and a very highly personalized version of the mashed potato, which I've never seen before or since. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I saw him stumbling through the lobby with his trademark Coke and cigarette for the first panel. He said, "Anybody who knows anything about me knows I had nothing to do with this panel or putting me on it at this hour in the morning. I always thought there was something semi-obscene about getting dressed in the dark." CPAC, another great legacy of Stan Evans. Then we went on to the '76 Reagan campaign in North Carolina, which Stan and Tom Winter. And if I had to pick out one person that I know Stan would want to mention, it's Tom Winter. He thought Tom never got the credit he deserved. He was a power behind the scenes and the font of many ideas for Stan, and a great friend and advisor of his. But in that expenditure effort in North Carolina, ACU put tens of thousands of dollars into newspaper, radio, and television ads, and really helped turn the tide for Reagan. If had it not been for the Reagan win there, you never would have heard of him again. Another great legacy of Stan's. He moved to Washington in '75 and took an active role personally in ACU activities. I remember once a coalition to stop the nomination of Paul Warnke to be head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. We were meeting, I think, in the Capitol Hill Club, and I think it was Morton Blackwell who announced excitedly, "Democratic Senator Sam Nunn has come out against Warnke." "Well, that's great," said Stan, "but does Nunn dare call it treason?" After leaving ACU, Stan started the Journalism Center, graduated over 1,000 students during his time. I was always, from the beginning, a member of the board, and these were board meetings I actually enjoyed attending. We always had barbecue in order to get Terry Scanlon to attend. And they dissolved quickly. No business was ever conducted. They just sort of degenerated into 3 hours or so bull sessions where we bantered and laughed at Stan's one-liners. Among them, Washington, D.C. is much like the Soviet Union without the amenities. Mayor Marion Barry wants to turn Washington, D.C. into a work-free drug zone. Mayor Barry's re-election slogan should be, "Give me Librium or give me meth." One meeting following a particularly dire financial report, Stan hated fundraising. He put the situation in perspective by observing, "Really, it's a wonder we're doing as well as we're doing. After all, I'm drunk half the time." A remark that left Dr. Casey Kay, Dean of Abilene Christian University, visibly stunned. Then there was the time Stan was selected by the Philadelphia Society to which was meeting in New York, I don't think they ever met in Philadelphia, to debate the affirmative on the topic, resolved this House would eminentize the eschaton. Beginning his argument on this fairly abstruse topic before an audience full of intellectuals of sundry types, Stanton said, "I've come up here to New York to kick ass." Stan was the best master of ceremonies in the conservative movement. I think we all could agree with that. He emceed a couple of events for Radio America, including our 15th anniversary, which was just after the death of Princess Diana. He said, "A lot of things have occurred in my lifetime that I thought I'd never see. Ronald Reagan elected president, the defeat of communism, Elton John singing in Westminster Abbey." He said, "When that guy came on the scene, I said, he's got a lot of talent, but he'll never sing in Westminster Abbey." In the last 5 years before he became ill, Stan came in weekly to meet with our interns at Radio America, and these college kids loved him, my daughter included. They were amazed that a man 60 years their senior could talk pop culture about things and people like Katy Perry and the Jonas Brothers and Lady Gaga, and mosh pit etiquette was actually one of his topics. In the case of Lady Gaga, he commented on the fact that she not only dressed entirely in meat for an appearance at the Oscars, but that she accessorized in meat, meaning she had a meat hat and meat purse and so forth. And he said he could think of two possible explanations for this. One, Lady Gaga was making a statement that God had given man dominion over the created order, and that therefore had complete control over the lower animals to use as he saw fit. Or two, she was just doing this to bring attention to herself. I'm coming to the end here. One of the most remarkable Stan Evans stories I remember occurred at CPAC 1983. I was waiting in the green room to introduce Jack Kemp. Alan Riskin was moderating a debate between Stan Evans and Bill Rusher on, was the Reagan administration really conservative? Well, Stan said no. He was ticking off all the apostasies of the senior White House staff, Ed Meese exempted, of course, really laying the wood to people like Mike Deaver, Richard Darman, David Gergen, Jim Baker. And the crowd was growing more and more agitated, I could hear outside the room. And inside the green room, the howling mob was beginning to unnerve Jack Kemp, who was starting to wonder whether he was about to step into a riot. And Stan said about the senior staff, they're not conservatives. They treat conservatives like some interest group to be appeased, like, and here you grasp for analogy, like handicapped Filipinos. He wondered later where he came up with that, had no idea. But well, the next morning back in the office, Stan's desk was covered with messages, and the phone was ringing off the hook with protests from Filipino Americans insulted by his remarks. One call was from the president of the Filipino American Society. "I hear you insulted Filipino people yesterday," he quipped. Well, thinking quickly, Stan stammered, no, that's the media for you. They distort everything. They take everything out of context. What I was trying to say is the White House is ignoring Filipinos just like they ignore conservatives. "You damn right," said the suddenly amiable president of the. "Hey, how would you like to be the banquet speaker at our annual convention in 2 weeks?" Stan paused. He knew a lot about a lot of things, but Filipino history, culture, and politics were not among them. He stammered and said, "Sure, of course," and after 2 weeks of intense preparation, he showed up, made a rousing speech about Filipino-American relationships and friendship, got a standing ovation, and then capped off the triumph by crowning Miss Filipino-American. I've gone on far too long, but a final word about Stan's lifestyle, a word he hated. Although he was deeply cultured and widely read, Stan had an intense love for middle America. I think he thought that average Americans, your basic American, as he would put it, speak more to the strength of a company than the intelligentsia do. But He told me once that back in Indianapolis, his favorite Saturday activity was to lounge around on a sofa in a pair of old khakis and undershirt, chomping on a loaf of Wonder Bread, washed down by a bottle of Big Grape while watching roller derby on TV. We all know of Stan's fondness for burgers and fries, Coke and red Jell-O, his contempt for fancy restaurants, gourmet food, and pretentious people. He also had little interest in material things, except for his books. It is true that he owned 2 houses, but they were basically storerooms for his books. For a staunch defender of capitalism, he also had very little interest in money. Over the course of many years, he was paid to do commentaries at Radio America, and we were always in arrears in paying him, sometimes as much as a year in arrears. He never brought it up, never once asked about that. That's just the way he was. What he cared about were what Russell Kirk called the permanent things: faith, country, family, and friends among them. I was privileged to have him as a friend for 48 of my 68 years. And however many years I have left, they just won't be the same. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Dave Keene. Dave is the opinion editor of the Washington Times, but he also served as the chairman of the American Conservative Union from 1984 to 2011 and president of the National Rifle Association from 2011 to 2013. A great friend and old ally of Stan Evans. Thanks, Dave.
I just want to point out that I was offended by the fact that Jim was demonstrating how spry he was, being younger than I am, to jump up on the stage the way he did. But having let that pass, I want to say that everything that's been said and will be said about Stan Evans today is true. He is as important as everybody has said he was. He was for many years the voice of conservatives. His revolt on campus in 1961 on the heels of Yaf Sharon's statement accelerated and gave substance to the infant movement of which we all are a part. His embrace of fusionism helped cement the coalition that allowed the movement to unite conservatives into a political force no one would have imagined possible before 1960. Stan's role as leader of the American Conservative Union and as the inspiration not only for CPAC, but Ronald Reagan's challenge to a sitting president in 1976, and as an engaging, witty, and intellectually rigorous hoarder and development of young conservative talents is without peer. I had the honor of following in his footsteps at the ACU and CPAC, but I've never pretended, even in private, to have filled his shoes. No one could. Though born a Texan, Stan migrated for some reason to the Northeast, to Yale and to NYU, but then ended up in Indianapolis, where his penchant for Midwestern values and simple hamburgers must have made him feel at home in an area when in that era eschewed fancy foods and gourmet restaurants. I remember attending an ISI meeting there in the early 60s. That evening, a number of us, in trying to decide where to go for dinner, went to the desk and asked the clerk at the hotel if he could recommend a decent French restaurant. He raised a Hoosier eyebrow and informed us that we don't have that many French people here, so why would we have a French restaurant? I assumed he was related in some way to Stan Evans, or maybe he was just one of his students. You know, Stan's influence stemmed from his intelligence and his ability to articulate in clear language the values that we share, but also from the fact that he had fun. And everyone who knew him had fun. He loved to toy with ideas and with people. His love of country, American values, and rock and roll made him the quintessential Hoosier conservative, regardless of Texas and his later return to the East. I was at the time at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. This is the pre-AF, pre-ACU, pre-Heritage Foundation days. We had something called the Wisconsin Conservative Club. And one of the things we did each year was sponsor a debate, the McCarthy-Evu debate. Evu, Bill Evu, was the publisher of the local newspaper, which had been referred to by Bill Buckley as Prairie Pravda. And Joe McCarthy needs no introduction. It was at the inaugural McCarthy-Evu debate that Stan observed that he came not to defend Joe McCarthy's goals, but his methods. Mr. Evu's newspaper really loved that. And his, of course, relationship with McCarthyism and McCarthy went on forever. His next to the last book was on Joe McCarthy. It took a long time in gestation. He worked at it, he researched it. And during the course of that period, ACU, as Becky will remember, had a dinner which we called the Conservative of the Century Banquet. ACU events in those days were covered by the Washington Post, not by political reporters, but by style reporters who came to make fun of the way we dressed. And as we were preparing for the dinner, Stan was, of course, there, and I was talking with him and with Bill Buckley, and Stan had a pile of papers which was the FBI response to his Freedom of Information request on Owen Lattimore, a well-known communist of his era. And Mr. Lattimore was one of the, of course, objects of Joe McCarthy's wrath and Stan Evans's investigation. This was a man who the President of the United States, Harry Truman at the time, had said was a great American. The first page in the Freedom of Information request was a document from the FBI saying that if hostilities broke out with the Soviet Union, he should be picked up immediately because he was a Soviet agent. The style reporter came up to us and began chatting, and she, of course, knew Buckley, and I'd introduced myself, and then she said to Stan, who she didn't recognize, "Are you a speaker?" And we had asked Stan to come and talk about Joe McCarthy because back in the old days, talking about Joe really got the liberal press upset, and we knew we could get coverage that way. So we figured, why not do it in Washington? And Stan said, "Yes, I'm a speaker." And she said, "Well," he said, "I'm here to speak of Joe McCarthy." And she looked at him quizzically and said, "Wasn't he bad or something?" I knew then the plan wasn't going to work. But she listened to us, and then she turned to Stan and said, "So let me understand this. You're Owen Lattimore." Stan and I talked, and I later said, "You should have said yes and confessed." But the one thing you could always count on being with Stan, and remember, once he got into that vein, he said he didn't really like Nixon until after Watergate either. He really focused on style. And everybody knew him, had fun with him, because he knew that while we're all engaged in something very serious, that life is too short not to enjoy. And Stan enjoyed his life, and we enjoyed him. As I was driving down to Leesburg for his funeral yesterday, I thought of Senator Tom Coburn's recent 60 Minutes interview. Leslie Stahl, for those of you who saw it, as she walked with the senator on his farm in Oklahoma, amazed at his good humor, asked him if it wasn't a struggle as he's fighting cancer. And Tom turned to her and said, "You know, Leslie, we all die. We shouldn't think about that. We should think about what we do while we're alive." Stan Evans's life was a life to be admired, a life to be respected. He made a difference, and we're all grateful for it and to have been a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Diana West is a nationally syndicated conservative American columnist and author of the books The Death of the Grown-Up, How America's Arrested Development is Bringing Down Western Civilization, and American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. Diana West.
Thank you very much. A story that Stan liked to tell me had to do with a letter writer, I believe, who identified what conspiracy Stan was part of, and it went like this. It was because James Jesus Angleton went to Yale, and Stan's father Medford went to Yale, and Stan went to Yale. Conspiracy. And then when I found out that I went to Yale, he said, good. He said, you're in it too. But I first met Stan Evans on the day I started reading Blacklisted by History, which I actually brought with me. I thought it should be here. This is, of course, the untold story of Senator Joe McCarthy and his fight against America's enemies. I was a brand new reader in all ways. I didn't know the world and many accomplishments of Stanton Evans. I knew precious little about Senator Joe McCarthy, just that he was the most reviled man in American history. As I read this remarkable book, I marveled page by page as the endless lies our society tells and tells repeatedly about Joe McCarthy were overturned by the weighty and the meticulous evidence that Stan, in a superhuman feat, had marshaled. In the process, he revealed something completely new and different underneath, and I was electrified. Informed and inspired, I would go on to write a book of my own called American Betrayal, which builds on the findings of Stan's magnus opus, Blacklisted by History, further testing its shocking thesis. Much, very much, indeed, practically everything I think Stan has said of what we are taught about our 20th century history is wrong. Stan would always say that he was a journalist, not a historian, but he was without peer the leading McCarthy scholar of our time. Now, it was in the writing of my book that I first took the opportunity to speak with Stan. I called him up, and thank goodness. And over the next several years, we became very good friends indeed. And one day, last year during his illness, we spoke of these things, and he said to me, "You were the reader I was waiting for." And I can't think of words that have affected me more. I mention them because they speak to the lasting, very much living legacy of Stan's work. If we have, as a society, have for half a century gotten practically everything wrong about McCarthy, starting with the basic fact that there were indeed, as McCarthy told us, communists and Soviet agents covertly embedded in the federal government, and starting with the basic fact that McCarthy was a great patriot, not some devil doll fetish object, what else have we gotten wrong? What other facts, what other heroes might be lost to us, buried beneath the construction of the false narratives that Stan disparaged as court history? What villains, what villainy has taken so many of our truths and truth-tellers away from us? These are big, enduring questions for all of us, all of Stan's readers to ponder. At least some of the answers lie, if we dig, within reach in a field I like to think of as investigative history. Stan's final work, which I also have here, which is his follow-up, he saw it as his follow-up to the McCarthy biography, Stalin's Secret Agents, The Subversion of Roosevelt's Government, co-authored with the late Herbert Romerstein, paves the way. As we reflect on the many remarkable things Stan accomplished in his 8 decades of life on Earth, it is well worth noting that he never stopped accomplishing. The Stan I am blessed to have known was ever on the hunt, still learning himself, always sharing his seemingly boundless knowledge, resolved to continue to unmask, to reveal, to seek the truth. We may take solace and inspiration both in the fact that everything we need to join him on this quest is right here. Thank you very much.
Lee Edwards' position here at the Heritage Foundation as a distinguished fellow in conservative thought is in a sense due to Stan Evans. In 1958, Stan introduced Lee, just back from Europe, to YR and YAF politics, and then published his first article in Human Events. Lee Edwards.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And yes, Becky is right. Stan did literally change my life when he persuaded me to join the DCYRs way back in 1958. He was running for vice president and he needed my vote. And he really convinced me to join when he said that the club had lots of pretty girls. And he was right, I married one. He also changed my life professionally by publishing my first article in Human Events, which, as we all know, was Ronald Reagan's favorite conservative weekly. Tom Davis is right. Stan was a great teacher who taught us many, many things, such as, and also borrowing from Diane, that Joe McCarthy was right. There were lots of communists in our government and in the highest places. Also, one of the most important things he said was in that wonderful book, The Theme is Freedom. Western liberty and America's free institutions are products of our religious faith, and they cannot survive without it. He also taught us the importance of the right diet. Now, asked what he had for breakfast, Stan was always very forthright. My usual breakfast, he said, is black coffee and cigarettes. Now, he was asked for an explanation, and Stan explained. Now, some people say, I don't have time for breakfast. I say, make time. Because breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Once asked to list the 5 most significant moments of the second millennium, he replied, the Magna Carta of 1215, the deposition of Richard II in 1399, I have the faintest idea what that means, the British Parliament of 1628, the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 and 66, and the American Revolution and the U.S. Constitution from 1776 through 1787. Now, those are 5, no doubt about it, momentous moments, but some of us were surprised that Stan omitted Elvis's first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. Yes, he taught us many, many, many things. He taught us how to pronounce marijuana. And there's no such thing as a too greasy hamburger. But seriously, once queried about his politics, Stan said, I think my philosophy is pretty close to the farmer in Seymour, Indiana. He believes in God. He believes in the U.S. He believes in himself. And this intuitive position is much closer to wisdom than the tormented theorems of some of our Harvard dons. That's spoken like a true Yale man. Rest in peace, Stan.
Chris Long is our next speaker. He's president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, where Stan served as a trustee from 1960 until 2013. Chris first met Stan as an undergraduate conservative student activist at George Washington University in the mid-1980s, and he worked closely with Stan over the next 30 years. Chris Long.
Well, thanks very much, Becky. And as you pointed out, Stan did, in fact, serve on ISI's board from 1960 until 2013. And despite popular opinion, ISI board seats are not hereditary and for life. No one is allowed to serve more than 3 18-year terms. We all have so many wonderful Stan Evans stories, and the great virtue about so many of them is they're actually true. And in spite of Jim Roberts' comments, Stan was really an ideas guy. He had a wonderful humor, but he was very serious when it came to ideas. And some of you were present last October when ISI held a tribute to Stan in New York City at the annual Dinner for Western Civilization. Stan couldn't be there. He was in the midst of his chemo treatments at the time, but one of his friends, George McDonald, was at the dinner and drove out to Leesburg afterwards to share the video tribute that you can see on YouTube. And I'd had a few short telephone conversations with Stan during the treatments. They're very short calls, and quite frankly, they were a little sad because you could just tell how weak he was over the phone. But then I received, my secretary yelled into the office, she said, "Stan Evans is on the phone for you." And I was shocked. I didn't think I heard her correctly. And I got on, and it was the same old Stan that I was so used to talking to, full of life, full of energy. And he was calling to tell me that he'd sat down with George MacDonald, he'd seen the video tribute, and how touched and moved he was by it. And George had taken him the dinner program, and on the dinner program we had printed a quote from The Theme is Freedom. And the quote was, "Virtually every doctrine, value, institutional development, and painful lesson gleaned through all the centuries since Magna Carta converged on the State House in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Here were combined the notions of the law above the king, the need to impose restraints on power, and the wisdom of diffusing authority instead of having it focused in one center. These were the chief political doctrines of the free society, annealed and tested in the fires of battle." Stan asked me, "How did you come to decide on that quote that was buried in the middle of the book?" He added, "You know, you chose the two sentences that perfectly sum up the central theme of everything I was trying to convey." His boss in Indianapolis, Eugene Pulliam, wrote in the 1961 foreword to Revolt on the campus, already at the age of 27, Stan Evans had established himself as one of conservatism's leading thinkers and writers, and his star is certain to wax even brighter with time. And I agree with Mr. Pulliam, Stan's star will continue to wax even brighter with time. And I'm very happy to announce that Jed Donahue and ISI Books will bring back into print What is Conservatism? First published by the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists in 1964, edited by Frank Meyer with brilliant essays by every major figure of the American conservative consensus. Not only Stan Evans, but Russell Kirk, Wilmore Kendall, Wilhelm Repke, Stephen Tonzer, Bill Buckley, and the famous essay by F.A. Hayek on why I am not a conservative. In Stan's powerful contribution to the book entitled The Conservative Case for Freedom, he takes equally to task what he calls the authoritarians and the libertarians, writing, "Affirmation of a transcendent order is not only compatible with individual autonomy, but the condition of it. And a skeptical view of man's nature not only permits political liberty, but demands it. An attack on traditional values after the libertarian fashion will not check the growth of state power, but contribute to its increase. An assault on individual freedom in the authoritarian manner will not restore us to virtue, because virtue cannot be legislated. Freedom and virtue have declined together and must rise together." Stan knew that freedom and virtue are not clumsily fused together by the blowtorch of political expediency. Rather, as works is the fruit of faith, so is virtue the fruit of freedom. Conservatives understand that they both are the essential ingredients in the realization of a humane society. Stan was an unabashed conservative, not a fusionist. After all, calling a conservative a fusionist is like calling a sun-dried plum a prune. And I know hardly anyone that likes to be called a prune. Well, my time is up, but let me just sum it all up by saying that Stan Evans was a plum of a guy. He was Mr. ISI. He could think like Frank Meyer, write like Bill Buckley, and read like Russell Kirk. In humor, he had no equal. He'll be sorely missed, and he will never be forgotten.
Ed Meese is our next speaker. Ed is another graduate of Yale University. He is our Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus here at the Heritage Foundation. He was the 75th Attorney General of the United States of America. Ed Meese.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to join all of you in celebrating the life of Stan Evans. Actually, I didn't know him well, but I knew of him at Yale. He joined the political union while I was president of that union, and of course rose to great heights within it as an advocate of the party of the right. Where else would he belong in the political spectrum of that day? You know, the interesting thing about Stan was the way in which he has been recognized after his passing by the headlines that occurred in papers from the Washington Post, the New York Times, Washington Times, and others. These are some of the headlines. Maybe you saw, I'm sure all of you saw at least some of them. But he was called the great, amazing, incomparable Stan Evans, a force behind modern conservatism, the wonderful M. Stanton Evans, the unique conservative voice, and a conservative icon. All of these are certainly starting points for paying appropriate tribute to what Stan has done. Our friend Lee Edwards, in talking about him, called him and kind of indicated the vast variety of things that he was to all of us. A journalist, an author, a teacher, a commentator, and a raconteur. I looked up trying to think of what kind of phrase would sum up Stan Evans, and I found it in the dictionary. It's consigliere. Because I looked up the definition, and it is trusted advisor. And I think there is no one to all of us who is more of a trusted advisor. He was a raconteur, and I'm sure we all remember his favorite one-liners. I've never forgotten how he warned the Philadelphia Society when he was master of ceremonies there that vodka corrupts, and absolute vodka corrupts absolutely. But I think that something that summed up his philosophy was what he called the doctrine of inadequate paranoia, which goes this way. When things are really bad, they tend to get worse. But I think of all the things that will remind all of us of his greatness. It was mentioned by David Keene when he mentioned his work with the Sharon Statement. You know, in that gathering in the fall of 1960 with a lot of young conservatives, a lot of ideas were voiced, people tell me, that a lot of different views were expressed, and somehow they asked Stan to write a summary, what would bring all of these ideas together. Now, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Thomas Jefferson is appropriately applauded for writing the Declaration of Independence, but we have Stan Evans, who wrote the Sharon Statement. And what he did was, in one page, incorporate the entirety of the philosophical foundation for the modern conservative movement, where he talked about free will and moral authority coming from God, political and economic liberty being essential for a free people and free institutions, where he said that government must be strictly and constitutionally limited, and that a market economy is the economic system most compatible with freedom. And he added, at that time, and it continues today, communism must be defeated, not merely contained. As we celebrate the life of Stan Evans, I think we would all agree that as the history of the modern conservative movement is being written, no one will have contributed more to it than Stan Evans.
John Merline attended the National Journalism Center in 1984, and from there went on to serve as editor of Consumers Research magazine. Washington Bureau Chief of Investors Business Daily, editorial writer, USA Today, and editor of the AOL News Opinion section. He's currently back at IBD as senior writer, and editor of its Capitol Hill blog. John Merline.
So last week, Mike Gonzalez called me and said, we're having a memorial service for Stan, and I said, that's great. And he said, we'd like you to speak there. And I said, wait a minute, you got John Merline here, not John Fund, definitely not Ann Coulter, to talk about the Journalism Center and Stan. Well, he insisted, so I thought, well, I have to come up with something to say. And what I realized in thinking about it is that I think a lot of people say that Stan changed their lives, had a great influence, but I can honestly say that I wouldn't be where I am, and that I literally owe everything I have right now to Stan Evans. I graduated from the University of Michigan with a degree in philosophy, so I had absolutely no prospects, no future. And fortunately, I happened to read National Review at the time, and I saw a little advert for the Journalism Center, and I thought, well, I got nothing better to do, I might as well apply for that. And somehow I managed to convince Tom Davis that I actually did have an interest in journalism, even though I didn't really have an interest in journalism. But it was at the Journalism Center that I learned what I really loved, and I loved journalism, but I especially loved it because of the way I learned it from Stan and the way he taught it. It was dig in, get the facts, go to original sources, and then write your story. And, it's pretty simple, but it's really amazing how many people in journalism don't get that. Afterwards, I had the privilege of working for Stan for about 7 years at Consumers Research Magazine. And I really learned everything about journalism that I hadn't learned at the NJC working under him for 7 years. He was a great editor, and he was a great boss. One time, I used to attend those board meetings too for Consumers Research, and I remember once he said, we're thinking of a motto for Consumers Research. The magazine that's small enough to be incompetent and big enough not to care. I also met my wife there. That's not an aside. I met my wife at the Journalism Center, so my career, my wife, my family, I all owe to Stan. And since then, after I left the Consumers Research, I always kept in touch with Stan. I always asked him for career advice. And occasionally he would call me when he saw something that I'd written that he liked. And my family wouldn't necessarily know who it was who was calling me until they heard me laughing my ass off for about half an hour, and then they'd know that it was Stan on the other end of the line. I do have I think I have a bit of experience about Stan that at least I haven't heard today. And one thing that always amazed me was how he was really a study in contrasts. Stan had an incredibly organized and logical mind, but his office was a complete disaster. I mean, he had bookshelves lining his office and books were falling off. He had mementos, he had pictures all sort of jumbled in there. There was you didn't even see that till you could see through the haze of smoke in his office. And then you'd also see the "thank you for smoking" sign there. I was asking my family, because I always tell them a lot of Stan stories. I said, can you remember any? And one of my kids says, oh yeah, you told me, he said, if you want fresh air, you can go outside. And then in the corner of his office was his three-legged dog, and of course, the name Stan gave the three-legged dog was Zip. And so the other thing is, I was thinking about it, and when I worked for him, Stan was 52, and that's my age now. And I got to tell you, it's a rare occasion when I'm up past 10 o'clock. But at that time, Stan was the one dragging us out to go dancing and drinking, always on a weeknight. And then he was always the first one in the next day. You know, we'd get in there and he'd already be there. The other thing that I loved about Stan was that even though he knew a lot of rich and famous people, he always delighted, it seemed, in befuddling them with his incredible wit, his bone dry wit. And he'd often tell us these stories, and one that I remember was he's saying he went to a Halloween party, and of course Stan never dressed up for Halloween, he just wore whatever he wore. And so this stuffy woman comes up to him and says, "Oh, and what are you?" And Stan says, "Kaposi sarcoma." And if you don't know, and I didn't, I said, "What is that?" He goes, "It's cancer of the eye." For some reason, it was in the news. I don't remember why. Anyway, the woman says, "That's not funny. A friend of mine died of colon cancer." Stan said, "Well, it's hardly the same thing." Anyway. One of the times that we were, so I thought that, you know, you can't, I was so glad to hear so many of his great lines, because that's what I always remember about Stan. He was just a delight, absolute delight. When I was working for him and we'd go out drinking, we'd close down the bar and then everybody'd hang out for about an hour on the sidewalk outside of the bar. And Stan used to call it Afterglow. And it became sort of a regular thing, and there's a bum who just sort of started hanging out, coming around, you know, because there'd always be somebody with some spare change, you know, hanging out at that time. And one time he asked Stan for money, and Stan reaches into his pocket, he says, "I'll give you this if you promise that you will only use it to buy liquor." "I don't want you wasting this on food." And the other thing that I loved about Stan was that pop culture was always, he was just so in tune with pop culture. In fact, he actually secretly wanted to be a TV producer. I don't know if any of you know this. And he would always tell us about these concepts that he was working on for TV shows. And one of them he had, it was called The Male Nanny and the Ghost. Well, he thought that title was too obvious, so he decided to rename it What's Going On Here? And then just not too long ago, he told me that he had an idea for a TV show. It was about married women who lived in different parts of the country. I said, "Oh, really? What's it called?" He goes, "Separate Housewives." Just a couple more. Not too long ago, Stan was recommending me for an editor job, which didn't work out. But he said, in telling me this, he said the editor, after he got off the call, was going to Google me. And Stan says, "And you'll know when that happens because it tickles." So it was kind of interesting how our lives would intersect. I ended up moving 5 years ago to a town. Stan lived in Western Loudoun, and I moved to one town over in Percival. Stan lived in Hamilton. Every once in a while, I'd run into him. One time he was working on his last book, and he was faxing stuff, because he didn't use email, so he'd go to the mail it all to do faxing, or email. I don't know how he did it, but somehow that's how he communicated. Anyway, every once in a while, we'd talk about, you know, restaurants we liked in town, and Stan said, "Well, I pretty much go to Hardee's in Leesburg every night for dinner." And I said, "Really?" He says, "Trust me, I know the importance of a balanced diet." He said, "That's why I go to the other Hardee's every once in a while at the other end of Leesburg." So, anyway, I was very sad to learn that he had passed. I knew it was coming, and as it does with all people, but now, every time I drive through Hamilton, which I do frequently, I will always be reminded of Stan's life and legacy and the fact that I will never hear his voice again, calling me up and making me laugh my ass off. But I take comfort in knowing that right now he's in heaven making everybody there laugh their asses off. So, anyway, thank you very much.
Stanton Denman is our next speaker. Stanton is also a graduate of the National Journalism Center, but more importantly in Stan Evans' life, he was an admiring young cousin. Stanton.
Thank you, everybody. I think they invited me to put a little gravitas to the ceremony, so. I apologize in advance for my voice. 10 days of remembering Stanton has taken its toll on me, so bear with me, please. Thank you very much for the privilege of being here today. It's an immense honor to share my stories with Stan with you. I know I speak for many when I share with you here what I think are probably universal memories of Stan. He was serious, he was earnest, he loved to surround himself with laughing children. I'm sorry, I have the wrong notes. Bear with me one moment. As was stated, my name is Stanton Denman. I've had the amazing privilege of sharing a name, and I'm going to cry, so I'm sorry. A name and a family with Stanton my whole life, as well as being a graduate of the Journalism Center. Probably won't be the last time today. I came to Washington 16 years ago. I'm still here. I now have a career and an incredible family. And like John said, I truly do owe all of it to my cousin Stanton. After listening to and reading stories over the past 10 days, it's almost a cliche, but the impact on my life that he had is incalculable. And even now, it continues. He's given me the honor of being at this podium and sharing these words with you. So thank you, Stan, and thank you guys for having me here. I really appreciate it. I asked to speak, and thank you for allowing me to. Similar to John, in the late 90s, after squeezing 4 years of undergraduate work into 7, I was at a crossroads. I was living in New Hampshire, a beautiful place, no doubt, but with no real job, a career, or direction. And I really didn't know where I was going with my life. At a family event in Mississippi that Stan attended, I had been pondering it that afternoon. I thought, why not? I screwed up my courage. Other than a marginal ability to write and a healthy interest in politics, I was mostly weaponless in facing the impending battle of being an adult. So there was a lot riding on this conversation. I thought, why not? I approached Stan when he took a break from holding court, as he did. I took a deep breath and I said, as blandly as I could, what he thought of the crazy idea of my attending the National Journalism Center. Silence. He took that pause that I think all of you know so very well. He looked at me quite seriously and he said, well, the thing is, we have an ironclad nepotism rule. I was genuinely crushed. My heart sank into my shoes. You see, he continued, if someone is a relative, we have to let them attend. That was the beginning of my life in D.C. I had the pleasure of sitting with Stan. I was doing some work with him and his mom. When I first started my career moving here, I would go out on the weekends and work in the yard. We'd get McDonald's at lunch. We'd have a beer after the day. He was always so generous. He helped me out in so many ways. But we would sit and talk about the the research that he was just starting to do in the beginning of the McCarthy book. What an amazing experience to get to sit with him, excuse me, every week and listen to this incredible story evolve and the man who was creating it. I could not begin to capture all the stories and emotions that I have about him. We all have them, that's why we're here. I will just try to speak on behalf of my family and the person that we knew. There's so many one-liners that people have said and said better than I can say. I will offer one vignette. Stanton was a very humble man, but there was also some competitiveness, and I think it started early. When he was, I'm not sure, I think 2 or 3, I think he was 2, he was in a competition with his cousin, my Aunt Sally, Melissa's mom. And the story goes, it was before my time, obviously, that Sally could sing the entire Isle of Capri, but Stanton could push the ottoman across the floor. So it was a toss-up to see who was going to go on to do greater things. And I want to talk about the family focus because he was a conservative icon, and I think as we look back on it with the perspective of time, he was a historical icon, but much more importantly, he was a family icon. He was at every family event that ever happened that I could remember. He always attended, whatever the locale or time, and I gathered from this that journalism was somewhat of a flexible endeavor. And he also told me at the Journalism Center that it was inside work and no heavy lifting, and I thought, this could be something. My mother threw a birthday party for my sister in her garage in a small town in New Hampshire. Maybe 12 or 15 of us were there. Stan came. That was the kind of person he was, and that's why we came, because we wanted to not miss a party that Stanton was at. Young, old, male or female, liberal or conservative, you wanted to be sitting at Stan's table. You really did. The competition for the funniest relative title in my family is a fierce one. It always has been, and Stanton always and effortlessly set the pace. He truly was the epitome of cool. The more I get to know him, the more I realize that. He was as sharp as they come. We've all seen him skewer some intended targets. He never, not once, used that prodigious wit on anyone, certainly within my scope, in a cruel way. He talked to anybody in my family here, any of their stories, he was always kind. He was so generous with his time. He was so damn funny. Our sides ached after parties with Stan, and I know we're all going to miss him at those parties. He wasn't an effusive man, but he showed his love through his action. He came to events large and small. He, like was mentioned before, he always asked how family was. He always inquired. Stan, I love you. I think we all miss you. The world is a much better place to have had you in it, but it's a much duller place without you. I'm personally not particularly conservative. I have a feeling Stan will continue to work on me in the hereafter. But I am here to help you honor one of the most amazing people I've ever known. And thank you for allowing me to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stanton. Well, now we've heard some amazing tributes here this morning. I'm sure all of us have read some of the wonderful tributes that have been written. I wish we had time to share those with you. But as we wrap up today, we have asked one final speaker to come to our podium to just take a few minutes. Actually, we told him he could have more than 3. To take a few minutes to kind of wrap up this package of Stan Evans and put a bow on it for all of us. Remind us of who he was, what all he accomplished, what he meant to us from the standpoint of freedom and liberty, freedom and ordered liberty. Ralph Kinney Bennett, please join me here on the stage. Ralph is a former Washington editor with the Reader's Digest. He was a founding board member of the Education and Research Institute and the National Journalism Center. He still is a writer and an editorial consultant who lives in Pennsylvania. Ralph Bennett.
Thank you for your remarks, Stanton. I know that was tough. I'm glad you reminded me because of Stan's famous dictum that about the National Journalism Center, that nepotism is not only condoned but encouraged. I'm here just as a mouthpiece, that's all, for some of Stan's dearest friends who chose not to speak today. Alan Riskind, Tom Winter, Bill Schultz, part of our little cabal here in Washington. There's another person I'd like to mention, Mary Jo Buckland. If you read the Bible, angels are always male. They're all male in the Bible. All the references to them are in the masculine, not the feminine. But my image of an angel is Mary Jo Buckland. She has done wonderful things and lived as a gracious person for Stan. There's no way anybody could ever imagine all the things that she's done for him. And I thank you. Stan taught me a little bit about phraseology, and there's one thing that for some reason came to my mind one time, and so it's not Stan's, but it's inspired by Stan, and in a way it captures kind of Stan's way of thinking. Give a man a carp and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to carp and you create a pain in the ass for life. M. Stanton Evans. Let's get beyond the beautifully tailored suits, the crisp white shirts, the meticulously knotted silk ties, the smooth and carefully barbered Paul Newman profile, the gleaming luxury cars, the opulently appointed and admirably organized office, the predilection for purebred dogs, and haute cuisine. He was a truly great man. Not just one of the great men of the conservative movement, but a great man and a great American. I always like to tell friends he was one of the greatest men you never knew. He had a superb mind, absolute intellectual honesty, and unmatched ability to communicate with the written and spoken word, and yet not a shred of pretension. Forget the magna cum laude degree from Yale. Forget the Phi Beta Kappa key. Did anyone ever see it? The honorary degrees, the national awards for journalism won so young. He was just Stan the man. He had an enviably sonorous voice with a finely civilized gravel to it. There was a whisper of Texas, Tennessee, and tobacco. It had that flat timbre of the Midwest and a hint of Mississippi in the accent when he was relaxed and talking about basketball or rock and roll, or the need to dance the New Deal away. That voice came across wonderfully on radio or television or in the lecture hall. In a speech or debate, that lower lip would drop slightly, and the words would come out considered, measured, and exact to the subject of the moment. He was a master of timing and understood the power of the pause. In a debate, he had this marvelous look. I always noticed it was a subtle sort of shadow that would pass over his face when some phrase or fact or pseudo-fact had issued from his opponent's lips. It was a look that told you his protean brain was reloading.
instantly selecting the right shell, the proper fuse. And the counter battery fire was always devastating. John O'Sullivan, in his tribute last week, I think correctly noted Stan's subversive personality. A personality that sought to quietly overturn disorganized thinking, wrong-headedness, or misinformed assumptions by simply showing, through marshaled facts and critical thinking put into the plainest words and with a piercing humor, that there just might be a better way, a correct way of seeing the issue of the moment. But for someone so facile with words, so adroit in argumentation, so possessed with a mordant wit, Stan Evans possessed a peculiar grace, one so rare that I cannot think of it in anyone else I know in quite the same fashion. It was a gift, I think, from both his parents. It tempered his intellect and his instinct. Stan had a deep, humble, Christian sense of the worth of every human being in the eyes of God. The man who could be so withering in his general regard of human folly and a terror to ideas that were not friendly to freedom was also naturally gracious and disposed to secret acts of kindness. In fact, he was one of the kindest men I have ever known. Generous, gracious, and sweet-natured. That penetrating wit, that sense of irony, that formidable and at times classically sarcastic sense of humor could have been wielded publicly and privately so many times in a destructive fashion. Stan could dismantle ill-thought ideas and flabby cant with deadly efficiency. But I never saw him talk down to anyone, look down on anyone, or treat anyone without due respect. From my own witness, whether it was a clerk in a store in Purcellville, a University of Chicago professor, an Indianapolis taxi driver, a U.S. senator, a church worker in Hamilton, a White House aide, or even the President of the United States, Stan always found comfortable footing with that person. He could diplomatically dismiss fools without being dismissive. And he could go toe-to-toe with the cleverest knave. Many a would-be debater who fancied he would leave a rapier mark on Stan's not-so-hollow chest soon discovered that it was Stan who brandished the rapier. Or was it a cutlass? While his opponent seemed to be wielding chain-link sausages. He had a remarkable wit, an all too rare complement to great wisdom. That wit was suffused with humor, and his sense of humor was the more acute because of that wit. Both of these qualities have been abundantly recalled today, but I'd like to put a little more perspective on them if you will allow me. I always loved the gift Stan had for leaving you half laughing, half puzzled at odd moments. Once we were taking a lobby break during some panel discussion that we were both participating in, and he looked at me and cocked his head slightly, always with a cigarette, of course, and had this look of deep bewilderment on his face. What do you think, Benet? Do I have too much false modesty or not enough? When not in his beloved house and refuge in Hamilton, Stan lived in a book-choked apartment in Washington. And as it's been mentioned, life in D.C. was a source of a recurring heartburn for Stan, who, busy with the world of politics and policy and ideas, remained semi-blissfully unaware of parking regulations, building and zoning codes, and all the bureaucratic impedimenta of the district. Car impoundments, parking tickets, futile arguments with sundry bureaucrats and stolid code enforcement officers were what prompted Stan to make the remark that's been mentioned here this morning, that the District of Columbia was definitely the Soviet Union, but without the amenities. He promised his dying mother that he would take care of her cats. A promise he carried out, even though it brought him uncomfortably close to being dubbed the crazy cat man of Hamilton. Herding and spaying eventually brought the problem under semi-control. There are 4 seats here. Please reach under your seats. If you find a ticket, you will get a free cat. I don't know who the lucky winner may be. Not particularly partial to the domestic feline breed, Stan hastened to explain to visitors and nosy neighbors that these were legacy cats and not his. But as many of us know, Stan's father had put up with the cats far longer than had he. And Stan even came to appreciate and adopt his father's all-purpose dictum for the unexpected and expected vagaries of life. If you think you smell cat shit, you do. When his mother, an amazing woman in her own right, died, I called to offer condolences. Stan said, "Benet, I have 2 concerns, one long range, one immediate. There are many cats. Many cats." What I asked was the immediate concern. The funeral service, he said, "I have to try to find an Episcopal priest with leanings toward Christianity." If I may, I'd like to move from cats to dogs. One evening, Mary Jo came back to stable her horse in Falls Church and found beside her tack box a quaking, whimpering, brown, mixed-breed puppy with a badly mangled front leg. Some children nearby had apparently dropped it from a balcony and in remorseful befuddlement left it at Mary Jo's stable door. The pup was clearly suffering. Mary Jo called her boss. "What should I do, Stan?" He immediately told her, "Put it in a box and wait for him." They would have to find a veterinarian. There must be one open at night for emergencies. In those pre-internet days that some of us remember, they consulted phone books. Anybody remembers this? And drove all around the Washington area looking for a veterinarian. Hours passed, but no matter how busy Stan was, this dog should not suffer. They finally found an all-night veterinary hospital somewhere out in Maryland. Expensive surgery saved the puppy's life. Eventually, the mangled leg had to be removed. Stan paid for everything and adopted the dog. Those were the days long ago when such a generous action would not require officious and intrusive interviews regarding owner suitability and detailed reports on the canine's prospective home, diet, and education. And thus came into being Zip, the wonder dog. The conservative Cerberus, I like to think of him, guarding the entrance to Stan's office. As we know, the classic Cerberus had 3 heads, and Zip had 3 legs. Stan, ever conscious of Zip's feelings, would introduce him as more or less your average 3-legged dog. One night, Stan was walking Zip along one of the darker streets on Capitol Hill when he was accosted by a youth. Apparently bored by tax-funded midnight basketball, which was in vogue at the time, this youth demanded Stan's money. Stan looked at him. Money? I'm so poor I can't even afford a 4-legged dog. Zip instinctively grasped that this was not a verbal put-down, but an escape tactic. And he just looked wanly down at the pavement. The young accoster regarded the hound at Stan's side and disappeared into the night. When, after a long, happy life, the renowned mascot of the National Journalism Center died, Stan tenderly wrapped him in a blanket and made a lonely nighttime drive out to Hamilton and buried his faithful companion in the backyard. He had 12 great years, Stan told me later, and those were dog years. This certainly puts the lie to all that nonsense about secondhand smoke. Stan was not happy with the way suburbia moved inexorably out and beyond Hamilton. In his early days there, he got a good laugh one Saturday morning when I came out and he and I were walking into the town post office. He was already accepted as a local, but I, clad in khakis and a Brooks Brothers shirt, aroused visible suspicion from a formidable-looking woman with a walking stick who stopped on her way into the post office and gravely scanned me up and down and asked, "Who are you?" This imperious query became Stan's regular greeting for me whenever I visited him in Hamilton. But the town's provincial isolation was fast fading. One day, it was not much more than a year later, Stan and I were driving to breakfast at the fabled White Palace in Purcellville. I said something about the pleasure of getting outside the Beltway and into a bit of real America. Stan exhaled a long fan of smoke and gazed out the side window. "It won't last, Benet. Last week I saw a man on Route 7 wearing a jogging suit." A jogging suit. He pointedly repeated and enunciated the words. It had little zippers on the bottom of the pants. He paused and took another long drag on the cigarette. "You know what's next. A health food store." Stan's idea of health food was somewhat at variance with what is now accepted for the meaning of the words. Tobacco, he always averred, was his favorite leafy vegetable. And as you mentioned, no one could miss the "thank you for smoking" sign on his desk. His other favorite vegetable, as we mostly know, was ketchup, preferably atop French fries. He liked a beer. He liked the occasional bourbon, never before a speech or debate, and preferred, as he said, the cheaper wines, the box wines. He liked RC Cola, but he doted on the Atlanta Elixir, the dark ambrosia Coca-Cola. Stan made the drinking of a Coke and the smoking of a cigarette a delectable ritual that could almost make one sigh. He would often, as has been mentioned here, come to breakfast, meetings, and conferences, sit down amid all the eggs and bacon and coffee in Danish, place a pack of cigarettes and a can of Coke on the table in front of him, and remind us, as his mother always told him, that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Stan detested Chinese food, which he called double meat rat snacks. Interestingly enough, as many of us know, the Monday Club met in a Chinese restaurant, the Hunan. But Stan would smoke his way through these luncheon meetings and then repair immediately to the 7-Eleven for a mid-afternoon repast consisting of a heavily laden burrito and a big gulp of Coke. Stan saw the big gulp as one of the more important advances of civilization. It combined drinking with weight training, which was very good for the wrist. As he would say, nourishment in abundance, and then a capacious ashtray. He also took a sly delight in the fact that in certain cultured settings, the huge cup could be disconcerting, even mortifying to those who might have what he called a dignity problem. Once, arriving late at a speaking engagement, he was still fortifying himself with a big gulp as he and dear friend Alan Riskend waited for the elevator up to the meeting room. After one last sip, Stan saw that the giant cup could fit atop a convenient one of those ashtray trash cans right beside the elevator, so he left it there. At the end of the speech, after the conversations and the schmoozing, Stan, and as it happened, Alan again, boarded the same elevator and went down. The doors opened to the lobby. They entered. The big gulp was still on the ashtray. I love these things. Big gulp. He picked it up. Riskin turned slightly pale, looking around in embarrassment as Stan walked off, quaffing a long, satisfying draft. Stan, as we know, was suspicious of most white meats, although pork was allowed because he loved barbecue. His taste, of course, ran to steak, hamburger, and good barbecue. He loved that, and was always a staple, as has been mentioned, of our ERI-NJC lunch meetings. Once, while dining at one of Washington's finer restaurants, with Riskin and the gustatorially fastidious Tom Winter, Stan waited while Tom carefully ordered a delicate and interesting dish. Then he asked the waiter for as close to a plain steak as you can get, and do you have French fries? When the steak came, Stan carefully forked across to the back of the plate some suspicious steaming vegetables. And then a crisply uniformed waiter bent by his side with a shiny silver container of Béarnaise. What? You want to ruin this perfectly good steak with that stuff? Tom did his best to suppress an eye roll. I will make a correction in the interest of objectivity, John. Stan held Roy Rogers restaurants in very high regard. One of the great benefits of living in Hamilton was its relative proximity to Leesburg, where there were, in fact, two Roy Rogers restaurants. This allowed him, as he liked to say, to add variety and balance to his diet by alternating between the two. This he did religiously, knowing everyone behind the counter and possibly in the kitchen at both places. My first meal with Stan after he moved to Hamilton was in the Roy Rogers, the one right on the way into Leesburg. We both lamented the gradual sophistication of Roy Rogers, the passing of the charmingly phony Old West decor, and particularly the demise of our favorite, French fries served in those cute little paperboard cowboy holsters. They should bring that back. In his books and articles, his marvelous research, keen analysis, and lucid writing is peppered with the same deadpan drollery that we've talked about here today. They're often the final flourish to a telling point. In the McCarthy book, which has been discussed here, that marvelous book, which incidentally, that book is a clinic on good reporting. That should be in every journalism school if somebody wants to understand what reporting really is about. But in that book, he has a devastating chapter on writer, scholar, spy, Owen Lattimore. And Stan found an old National Geographic article that Lattimore had written. And Stan quotes extensively from it where this Soviet scholar apologist portrayed the odious Soviet slave labor death camp at Magadan Kolyma, the gold mines there, as a sort of Siberian arts colony. With, as Lattimore said, a first-class orchestra and ballet company. A place where instead of the sin, gin, and brawling of an old-fashioned gold rush, there were extensive greenhouses growing tomatoes, cucumbers, and melons to make sure the hardy miners get enough vitamins. Stan merely followed this exuberant Lattimore quote by recalling Robert Conquest's reporting on Magadan Kolyma as one of the deadliest of all the labor camps, killing off almost a third of its inmates each year. Of course, Stan then notes, without all those cucumbers and tomatoes, the death toll might have been even higher. He anticipated Jonah Goldberg's marvelous book by almost half a century. In his book, The Liberal Establishment, written long ago, he concluded that liberalism, taken in its documentable and lamentable reality, is little more than, as Stan said, a genteel American version of fascism and a creed profoundly hostile to freedom. His love and knowledge of rock and roll has been mentioned many times and how it seemed incongruous to some, but it was a legend in itself. No 50s group, no one-hit wonder was too obscure. I still remember a particular incident long ago in a crowded suite in Chicago after a Philadelphia Society meeting. It was the same meeting where I met you, Juliana. Stan was in an intense discussion with two very distinguished-looking older gentlemen. We were young then. I was half lost in admiration of Stan's learned exposition on something to have to do with who actually wrote the Vindicia contra Tyrannos, when suddenly he cocked his head slightly, turned to me, and snapped his fingers, sending the cigarette ash flying, and says, "Whispering Bells, the Dell Vikings, Cripps Johnson." The music was playing in the background. Having not only known the song, that was easy, the group, pretty easy, but also the group's obscure, sometime lead singer, Stan then returned seamlessly to the discussion with the two slightly perplexed men. That was Stan the man. We shall not see his like again. The locals around Hamilton may have known him only as the old guy with faintly jowly simian features, wearing a Coors beer hat as he drove around in his beat-up Chevy pickup truck. What they would have made of the books, journals, and papers and research stuffed around on the seat of that truck, I don't know. It pleases me to know that yesterday when we lowered him into the ground next to his dad and mom, that Coors hat was in his coffin, not his Phi Beta Kappa key. He had a long and painful end. He faced it fearlessly, with real bravery and humor. "I'm dying, Benet," he said the last time I called him. He would say no more, because he did not wish friends to feel uncomfortable. Mentally sharp to the last, he was unfailingly gracious to nurses, doctors, hospital workers, and those who came to see him, except for a social worker who wanted to get some questions out of him. He used the famous kingly Stan wave to tell them to leave the room. His whole life was dedicated to liberty and speaking truth in its defense. He understood perfectly how daunting it is to have God's gift of freedom, to be placed at risk in God's universe, subject to its laws, physical and moral, and to the consequences of contravention or obedience. He was, I believe, the most humble man I have ever known. And it was a true Christian humility, not some felicitous gift of genetics, but learned and practiced and made a habit. Stan knew how smart he was. He relished the accolades. He deserved more. But within his great wisdom, he understood what it was and who he was in the eyes of God. He was a great man and a good man.
Thank you so very much, Ralph. I want to acknowledge that we have some of the NJC students with us today. I hope you will take a minute to visit with them while we're enjoying a light lunch and a moon pie. And I want to also acknowledge Mary Jo Buckland. Thank you, Mary Jo, for doing so much to help our good friends. And with that, we're going to close. Those of you who might be interested in having a copy of this DVD for your memories or to share with people that you know wanted to be here but could not be, please do let us know. And in the meantime, let's go have a light lunch and share more stories about our friend Stan. Thank you very much.